Good evening, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. I'm Tessel Collins, board member of the Ford Hall Forum, where our programs provoke thought and encourage you to listen, learn, and engage. Before we begin the Ford Hall Forum, would like to thank our generous sponsors, including and among others, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Barr Foundation, the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, and our partners at Suffolk University, which serves as the forum's home base, and we thank them very much. We also encourage you to visit our restaurant sponsor, the Woodward at the Ames Hotel, after the forum. Linda Schwartz is the winner of our Scholars Draw tonight and will receive a free stay for herself and a guest at the Ames Hotel. That's one of the ways we thank our members whose generosity makes our free public events possible. If you are not a member yet, please become one today by visiting the information table before you leave. Our moderator for the evening is Candelaria Silva. Candelaria Silva is a freelance arts and marketing professional, facilitator, and writer. She was the director of the Cultural Economic Development Program, ACT, Arts, Culture, and Trade, Roxbury, from its inception in 1998 until August 2007. Silva conceived and developed ACT Roxbury's signature programs, including the Roxbury Film Festival, Roxbury Open Studios, Roxbury Literary Annual, Roxbury Playwright Mentorship, and the Roxbury Discussion Series. She is most proud of being part of the team that rehabbed Hibernian Hall and brought it back to life, as well as the 4 Roxbury holiday shopping guides that were inserted in the Bay State Banner and Boston Globe. Her work as director of ACT Roxbury was profiled in several publications, including the Creative Communities Builders Handbook. Silva currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the Henderson Foundation. Please give a hand to our moderator, and my wife, Candelaria.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if he was going to own me or not. Before I get started, in addition to thanking the Ford Hall Forum for having me back a second time to moderate, which shows that I didn't do such a bad job the first time, and I hope history repeats itself, I want to give a shout out to a friend who couldn't be here tonight. Her name is Patricia Carrington. She called me up one afternoon to say, turn on C-SPAN, turn on C-SPAN. There's this woman talking about buying black for a year. And that woman was Maggie Anderson. And from that, I knew that I wanted to have something to do with bringing her to Boston at some point. So my job is to introduce the speakers, and then we're going to show a short film that Maggie has, and then we're going to have a discussion, and then we'll have Q&A. Maggie Anderson, as CEO and co-founder of the Ebony Experiment Foundation, Maggie Anderson has become the leader of a self-help economics movement that supports quality black businesses and urges consumers, especially other middle and upper class African Americans, to proactively and publicly support them. She has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and CBS Morning News, among many other national television and radio shows. Anderson received her BA from Emory University and her JD and MBA from the University of Chicago. She has participated in successful political campaigns for Representative John Lewis, Mayor of Atlanta Bill Campbell, and Barack Obama's campaign for U.S. Senate. In addition, she has done work for the Rainbow Push Coalition and was an executive at McDonald's. Our other speaker is Thomas Shapiro. Professor Thomas Shapiro directs the Institute on Assets and Social Policy and is the Pockross, is that how you pronounce it? Pockross Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. His primary interest is in racial inequality and public policy. He is a leader in the asset development field with a particular focus on closing the racial wealth gap. The Hidden Cost of Being African American was named one of the notable books of 2004 by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. With Dr. Melvin Oliver, he also wrote the award-winning Black Wealth, which received the 1997 Distinguished Scholarly Publication Award from the American Sociological Association. As well, it won the 1995 C. Wrights Mills Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems and was named an Outstanding Book of 1996 by the Gustavus Meyer Center for the Study of Human Rights in North America. His media appearances include Tony Brown's Journal, The Tavis Smiley Show, Talk of the Nation, CNN, and On Point. His work has been reviewed and discussed in places like the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the American Prospect, the Chicago Sun-Times, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Commonwealth Magazine, Newsweek, The Village Voice, and many others. I know you'll join me in welcoming both of them tonight. And as I said before, we'll have a short 5-minute film before we begin our discussion. Thanks.
Couple says they want to solve what they call the crisis in the black community. They want to, as they say, buy black. The African-American couple from Oak Park travel farther than they need to in order to make purchases from black-owned businesses.
A growing number of African-Americans have decided to only support black businesses. We looked at one family's year of buying black.
Liquor store, funeral home. Liquor store, funeral home. This is what the black community is. I want to change this.
This is crime-stricken West Chicago, not so far from Barack Obama's Chicago home, where Maggie Anderson is implementing her own plan for change in America, a crusade to resurrect black-owned businesses.
For the past 6 months, my family has been living off of black businesses. For the next 6 months, we're going to do the same thing. This year-long project we call the Empowerment Experiment.
First of all, this is an academic exercise that we're trying to bear out, from a statistical standpoint, how, if more dollars are reinvested in particularly underserved black communities, that we can bridge a lot of the social gaps.
Which is Magic Johnson's whole thing about trying to build more businesses in black communities.
So for some people, it may be a controversial method, but it's definitely a laudable goal.
Good to have you both with us. What got you doing this, guys?
Well, actually, this pledge came out of a conversation that happens in a lot of African-American black middle-class households. We're talking about ways we can give back to our community. And for us, we were just very frustrated with the asymmetry between all of the awesome black talent, all of these wonderful black resources that's approaching now $1 trillion in black buying power, and what's actually reinvested in and represented in our community. So our frustration with that asymmetry and are just wondering if we just try to support black businesses, maybe we can do something to give back to those underserved communities we care about and come from.
A Chicago couple is conducting an economic experiment. They're trying to make all of their purchases from black-owned businesses. Here's the question, can they do it? Here's another question, should they do it? CNN's Susan Rosegen has details.
I also need some shrimp.
Maggie Anderson better have all the items on her list before she leaves the supermarket. Because if she doesn't, it's a long way back. Anderson has to drive 20 minutes from her home to the only grocery where she'll shop, the one that has a black owner. She'll also drive out of her way to eat at a black-owned restaurant, get clothes cleaned at a black-owned dry cleaners, and keep her money in a black-owned bank.
You know what,
Maggie and her husband John have made a public pledge to try to buy only from black-owned businesses for 1 year. They call it the Empowerment Experiment, empowering black communities by supporting their businesses. Critics call it an experiment in racism.
We're not advocating that anybody make purchases along racial lines. Okay, that's not what we're advocating. What we are advocating, though, is that African Americans do have a higher sense of duty to support black businesses that are investing in the community.
But the goal is the same.
At the end of the day, this is just about people, in the African American community getting their representative share of the American dream.
And I read that you thought that even some people you knew, some others that you didn't know, trying to start businesses, African Americans, they weren't taken seriously or they weren't viable businesses because they couldn't get enough people to go along with them. One reason behind this?
Well, to the extent that that has to do with us, we have to cure that. We do believe that, of course, the crazy failure rates of black businesses and the difficulty it is to get one started may have to do with our history here and lack of access to capital and networks. But to the extent that it has to do with black, predominantly middle-class folks, not supporting those businesses because of stereotypes or just not knowing that they're there, that's a problem.
But sometimes as I live this new life, as I make sure that my money enriches my community, as I defend this concept on CBS News with Katie Couric, as I read the hate mail and wonder whether some lunatic might actually act on his fear of a thriving black community, as I travel leaving my husband and my girls so I can share our journey with our people, as I grow more saddened as I see firsthand the plight of black business and the sight of my people who are struggling just to hold it together, as I have to find a way to explain to my 4-year-old that she's not gonna have a Chuck E. Cheese birthday party, she's gonna have a Kenny Johnson's Little Jim birthday party this year, and why it's gonna be all the better.
So Maggie and Tom, I've read both of your books. Your theme, Maggie, is that the dearth of black-owned businesses and the leakage of money rapidly out of the black community is a key reason for economic disparity, to agree. And Tom, you look at the fact that whites have the ability to and tradition of transferring assets as a key to their societal position and benefits. What is the role of private family money in passing inequality along? Could you talk about that for a minute?
Thank you. First of all, welcome everybody. It's a great treat for me to actually be on this side of the stage after living in Boston now for many, many years. So I do appreciate the opportunity. In the work I have done along with others, when we look at, for example, how families get to buy their first home for the first time, especially a young family with young children, what the data tell us and what the stories we collect confirm what the dynamics are about, that there's a lot of family financial support, especially in housing markets before the financial crash, before the housing markets imploded, and even afterwards now as credit has gotten so much tighter. So in the families that we personally interviewed, first starting back in 1998 and 1999, literally every single family of the 200 we interviewed that were homeowners needed significant financial support from their parents or their kin to buy that first home. That it was almost impossible to get into that housing market. Now, just a quick data point in terms of who actually has the ability to pass wealth from generation to generation. When you look at the numbers, not many whites do. But a lot fewer African Americans have that same opportunity. So that approximately 4 times as many white families are able to pass significant wealth along to their young adult children so they can buy that first home or do whatever they want to do. When that money is passed along, it's not simply a 4-to-1 ratio, but the average amount of money that's passed along is 10-to-1. That is, for every dollar of inheritance that an African American family is able to give for home ownership or college or education or anything else, a similar white family is able to pass along $10.
Okay. So we'll get more into those disparities.
Sure.
Maggie, what did you find out about black businesses? And as I was telling you when we met a little bit earlier, those of us in Boston, which has a small black community, are always assuming that places like Chicago, New York, have it going on. What did you did this in Chicago? What did you find out?
Well, the term "have it going on" I still think would be a strong term for any city in America in terms of its black businesses. In terms of a thriving black community, large black population, we can definitely say we have it going on. But that's the whole thing. People just assume that that would reflect in terms of our business strength. And while we may have a large number of black businesses, those businesses, for the most part, are sole proprietorships, so they're not employing anybody. Those businesses die between, within a year, maybe last 3 years.
And a lot of that is due to a lack of demand. And those businesses aren't generating the receipts and revenues that other minority businesses are, and way behind their white counterparts. So while we have businesses, we don't have business power. And that's just on the local level. That's just in your classic B2Cs, you know, your dry cleaner, your mom and pops on the corner. In the corporate space, the disparities are much, much worse. So what we hope to expose in the experiment is kind of a more comprehensive view of what my brother Tom has been trying to present to the world for so many years. We want people to start looking at our community through a business lens. And for the most part, our role in this economy, how we're treated in this economy, is as the consumers and the laborers. We're not seen as business people. Our kids can go, you know, their whole young lives and never, I ask them when I lecture to kids all the time, have you ever seen a black dry cleaner? They say no. Grocery store, baker, they say no. So there's no concept of us as a business force. So even in Chicago, where we have, I think, 96,000 black-owned businesses, they're small, they're suffering, and most of them are concentrated in those typical black industries, your barbershops, your braid shops, fried chicken shacks, fried fish shacks, funeral parlors. For your basic everyday needs, there are still grocery stores in the black community. There's still liquor stores in the black community. There's still dry cleaners. There's still auto shops. There's still clothing stores. But none of those are owned by black people. So we're spending money in those enterprises, but we lack representation in terms of owning those enterprises. So while we may have a lot of businesses, we don't have any business strength, especially in those areas where we're spending the most money. And that leads to, a whole dearth of all of the financial and wealth disparities that Professor Shapiro puts out to the world. But it also reinforces a huge cultural problem in our community that Brother Shapiro probably wouldn't even be able to examine. And that's just the issue that we don't support each other. So that's why even though we have a lot of businesses, we have no business strength. And because we don't have no business strength, we don't have the economic and entrepreneurial core that we need to be self-sustaining.
Okay, so there are several reasons why black businesses don't do well, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'm going to go back to Tom with a question. You talk about the fact that racial inequality is increasing in this new area of a more lenient and inclusive society. Explain the difference that you talked about in the book between moving up because of one's own efforts and moving up because advantages have been passed along.
Yes, that's a key theme that I like to look at. And I think it really taps into what we think of as a core part of the American dream, and that is the idea of meritocracy. That given a rough sense of parity in opportunities, if to the extent that exists, that people's skills and talents and hard work really will pay off in terms of their well-being and their lifestyle and the opportunities they can afford for themselves and their families. But it doesn't quite work out that way. I can put it in a quick phrase. If we think about inheritance, you can't have inheritance and meritocracy running side by side. You might want to think about a balance, but there's a way in which I talk about transformative assets. That is the kind of inheritance that can occur not simply at the death of a parent or a kin or a loved one, but also the kind of financial resources passed along for things like buying a first home for a young couple, for a young married couple. And that happens much more readily in the white community than it does in the African American or the Latino community for that matter. And the impact of that is literally to jump that family that has the capacity to bring resources that they didn't earn in the way we think of earning it, to jump them into a community and their kids into a school system that their earnings, that is their merit, can't afford to them. So that's a key way in which advantage and disadvantage is passed along at the same moment.
Okay. So one of the things you also said, and I'm going to have Maggie respond to this, is that it is virtually impossible for people of color to earn their way to equal wealth through wages.
Right.
So if just getting a job or getting a good job is not the way, then let's talk about, what would business development do? And then I'll also have you respond, but I'll have you do it, Maggie.
People always ask, when I speak about this and in the book, I always talk about what we used to have. And when I tour the country, people are always coming up to me saying, I grew up with businesses in my community. And the point is, we used to have that entrepreneurial spirit, passing it down. We used to have all these businesses because we were forced to. We had to support one another because of segregation. And there is the perfect storm of events that happened that got us where we are today, that got us from owning 6,400 grocery stores in the United States of America and now maybe having 10 in the United States of America. There's something that got us to that, and part of that is this thing about the jobs. So once we became integrated and corporate America, we started in droves supporting those brands that wouldn't let us support us before. Basically to demonstrate our value to general society. We wanted to show them how equal we are by giving them as much money as we could. They started to notice the value of the black consumer. So in so doing, they started marketing to us, and we responded greatly to that marketing. We were very excited. Colored on is what we used to say, colored on TV. We're so excited to see a black family on TV. We'd respond with our money. Then after that, they started recruiting us into their ranks so that they could take more of the black consumer dollar. And that was kind of my generation. So for my generation, the key was not to open up a business the way it was in the generation before me. The key was to get a good job at a big white company. That's how you made your family proud, getting a good job. So instead of putting a talented young person like me into entrepreneurship, where I could build an institution, a lasting institution, and transfer wealth, the major goal for someone like me, the talented folk in the community, would be to get a job. So we were limiting ourselves, cutting ourselves short by just getting those good jobs. And everyone can't get those jobs. So if that's the goal of the community, if that's where you want to send all the young people into corporate America, and all of us can't get into corporate America, we're totally cutting ourselves short. We don't teach our kids to be entrepreneurs. And since the kids didn't see entrepreneurs in the community anymore, they didn't aspire to that themselves. So it's very limiting in terms of wealth transfer, and that wasn't on the radar screen. It was just being, achieving the American dream. It wasn't about building up wealth in our community, making our community grow the way other ethnic groups come here with that specific goal in mind, building up their community. We never had that goal. It was just about making sure we were just as good as the Joneses. So we got the good job, made enough money for ourselves, never thought about wealth transfer. So we're always just getting good jobs and not building up businesses that can transfer wealth. And it's very difficult to get those jobs for all the reasons that we know. Some of it has to do with racism, but it's very difficult to get the kind of jobs that will build up the wealth that our community needs for the total economic upheaval.
I would also say that even not only your generation, my generation, I remember when I was in college, we were actively discouraged. Nobody ever talked to us about opening businesses, even though I remember a lot of black businesses growing up in St. Louis. And so that's very, very interesting that we weren't pushed. And in my family, we weren't pushed into corporate jobs because that dream hadn't become a reality yet. But we were put into, my grandmother said, get a good government job, be a teacher. So 90% of my family are teachers, and the other ones work in the post office. So they work for St. Louis has a huge record that those were the kinds of things. So that when they first started having government layoffs, my grandmother could not believe it. She's like, what has happened? Because that was something like, she pushed everybody get a government job. And so that really changed the notion of what was safe and what was predictable, the safety, the predictability of it. Wealth is different from income. Okay, so I'm going to have you talk about that as well as respond to what Maggie was saying.
Sure. Let me add on to,
Yeah.
to the great points that Maggie was making. You know, there is an amazing story that needs to be told in much more full detail than we've had the opportunity to. And that is the incredible African-American middle class that almost didn't exist in the United States at the beginning of the 1960s and developed over a course of a generation because of the change in laws, because of a civil rights movement, because of some change in custom, not every place, and not as well as it should have changed. But the doors of opportunity at universities, at some corporations opened up. And the basis today of the African-American middle class is largely based on education, jobs, doing very well at jobs, teachers, lawyers, people in the medical professions, and government work and civil service work. And that's a very solid pillar of that African-American middle class. But it's only one pillar. It's only one pillar that, unfortunately, has a great deal of difficulty reaching into the future about passing those opportunities and that well-being along to their children. And that other pillar that's missing is the wealth pillar. And wealth, just quickly, is obviously different from income. It's the stocks, bonds, the equity one has in one's home, which is, for most American families, is by far the largest piece of wealth we will ever have, and that is even more so in communities of color, both in the Hispanic and the African American community. And it's that wealth pillar that is lagged so far behind, not because of, I would suggest, not because of lack of achievement. In fact, when achievement is equal, when you compare African American and white middle class, college educated, homeowners, professionals, same income levels, one would expect, or the economists should tell us to expect, the wealth should be equal. But it's not. In that scenario of successful white and black middle class, the white middle class has 4 times as much wealth as the African American middle class. So that gap exists, and income, that good job, we shouldn't underplay, and I don't think anybody here is trying to underplay. We're just trying to make a few important distinctions here. A good job and a good income really, in fact, does pay off. It is not the total solution, which is why I do say you can't earn your way out of the wealth gap. You can go a quarter of the way. It's much better to have the glass 1/4 full than 10% full, but oh my gosh, it's still 75% empty.
Okay. You had a quote in your book, Maggie, from Michael Schuman, which says, "The principal affliction of poor communities in the U.S. is not the absence of money, but its systemic exit." You talk about leakage. Can you talk a little bit about leakage and also the dollar circulation, if you remember?
Sure. And the thing about the leakage and the dollar circulation, you know, it's something that it's a cultural phenomenon that we talk about in the black community. You know, one of the jokes is, you know, how fast the dollar leaves the black community. So if you're trying to explain to someone something moving very quickly, you'd compare that to the dollar. And we'd make jokes about it in our movies, in our songs. We talk about how the businesses in our community are not black owned, how we don't support each other, all these things, but there's never, although we knew the problem existed, we never studied it, we never saw it, we never connected it to how much we suffer disproportionately in all the social and economic crises. So when we started on this journey, it was really to confront those cultural issues. Why is it that we don't support each other? Why is it that our dollar leaves? Why is it that most of the businesses in our community are not black owned? It's really just all that cultural stuff. It's just a pride thing, taking a stand. And then maybe 1 week before we went into the experiment, we learned of this phenomenon called leakage. And a friend of mine from the Chicago Urban League said to me, "Maggie, this is not about buying black. It's about leakage. It's about how fast money leaves the African American community." And that's when we really started to study this, putting our MBAs to work for important stuff. And that's when we learned that this thing about dollar circulation. So what we learned from other secondary research is that, say, in other communities that do support each other publicly and proactively, like your Asian, different Asian communities, your Jewish community, different Middle Eastern communities, different ethnic Europeans like your Greek people, Italians, Polish people, Indians, as in Indians from India, that all those groups proactively support each other. So their dollar stays in their community anywhere from 15 to 28 days circulating before it goes outside. So typical Chinese family comes home, puts that money in a Chinese bank, stops at the Chinese-owned grocery store, stops at the Chinese dry cleaner, picks up their kids from the Chinese daycare center, donates some of their money to Chinese-oriented causes, has Chinese professionals that they are supporting all day, every day, keeping that money, and it stays in the community, funding the school system, keeping that community safe and clean for 28 days. That's the dollar circulation. In our community, the strong black community that built this country, 400 years, great black community, we keep that dollar for 6 hours. As soon as we come home, we put that money in the check cashers. And that check casher is totally not locally owned. And they take that money outside of the community and do with it what they will. They build up their own school systems and pay for their dream vacations. Or we go to, let's say, Arab American owned food and liquor, because black people are the only people in the United States that have to buy their groceries from liquor stores. So we go to the food and liquor to buy our groceries, and that is not a locally owned business, and that maybe Middle Eastern family that owns that store takes that money outside of the community to their enclave and builds up their school systems and send their kids to college with our hard-earned wealth. That's leakage. And that money, if it were to circulate and stay in our community, could build up our school systems, could build up the economic and entrepreneurial core in the community. It would, those businesses would be locally owned, so those businesses would feel more vested in the community. They would provide more quality goods and services. They wouldn't disrespect the consumers that come there. The consumers would feel more connected to them. We'd have all that communal pride that's necessary for a self-sustaining community. All the wonderful benefits of having locally owned businesses would be attributable to the black community. That doesn't happen. So leakage is the worst thing for a community that's trying to build itself up in America. And we suffer from leakage the absolute worst. 6 hours versus 28 days. That's the whole problem.
So that was one of the things that you said that was very sobering for me as I looked at that. During your empowerment experiment, which was originally called the Ebony Experiment, but we will let people read your book to find out why that name changed.
We need a whole nother hour.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about that here. You looked for you not only tried to support black-owned businesses, you sort of expanded and you looked for black-owned products at mass retailers as one way. What were the products that you found the most difficult to purchase during that?
Well, it was interesting because the first real attempt for a mass retailer, there's a Walmart less than a mile from my house. And I went to the Walmart first, and they boast how they have thousands of SKUs from black vendors. So I was like, oh, I'm going to find everything I need at Walmart right here. So I went to their manager. I talked to them. Can you help me find products from black vendors? Oh, we don't categorize it that way. That's understood. Maybe I can talk to someone in supplier diversity and corporate. They have to know who their vendors are. Here's a list of things I need. Can you help me? About weeks, this whole process. After all of that, we found at Walmart, big fancy Walmart in my community, all the consumers you see there are black. Everyone is black there, even though my suburb is probably 20% black. Some of the surrounding suburbs are black, so all of the consumers in that Walmart are black. And we found 2 products on the shelves. Hair care, 2 hair care products. Most of the hair care products, ethnic hair care products, are still not black owned, but they did have the decency to have Luster's, which is still black owned, and Bronner Brothers products, which is still black owned. So I'm able to buy that at Walmart. That was quite sobering, because I'm thinking Walmart is the king retailer. If Walmart only has black hair care, what am I going to expect to find at a JCPenney or at a Kmart or at a grocery store? So it became difficult. I've become a master at this now, so I talk to supplier diversity folks, and I know a lot of suppliers, and I know who are the best ones to actually put products on the shelves. But that is the supplier, vendor, franchisee, and dealer diversity piece is huge. What we started to learn in trying to abide by this experiment was how wholly disenfranchised Black businesses are from the corporate space. So the heartbreak was, of course, going through the west side of Chicago and not finding any Black businesses there. When you really start digging into this and going into a Walmart and seeing all the consumers there are Black, but not seeing anything on the shelves coming from the Black community, that's a painful thing to absorb as well. And the point about it is, though, that a lot of that $1 trillion that is escaping the Black community represents about $1 trillion in buying power now. There's different estimates, but $1 trillion is kind of safe. A big chunk of that is in corporate America, in your Polos, in your Hennessy's, in your Walmarts, and all these brands that Black consumers totally keep alive. And it is only fair that we're able to bring some of that money home to our struggling community through our business owners. So why can't, say, a Walmart engage more Black businesses in their supply chains, on their shelves? The big retailers, the big franchisers have more Black-owned franchises. That would be a better way to demonstrate they value our community. If you care about us so much, put some of our products on the shelves. A table at the NAACP conference is insulting to me. It's not good enough. For you to tell me that you have a few chocolate chips in your executive ranks is not good enough for me. For the amount of money that, say, Hennessy makes, over 50% of their global revenue comes from Blacks in the United States of America, and they do no business with Black businesses. For the amount of money they make off the Black community, there should be hospitals built by Hennessy, much less maybe a trucking company, janitorial firm, IT firm, lawyers, something needs to come. We need to have more Black inputs in the supply chains and more products on the shelves. And this was the only reason I even thought of it, with the fancy MBA, with John having the fancy MBA, was because we engaged in this experiment. So the whole point of the experiment is for us to start looking at these issues. These businesses are wonderful. We love them. We give them our blind loyalty. Why aren't they doing business with us? Is a commercial good enough? Is a table good enough? Especially considering how much our community is suffering. Considering we are so behind in every kind of way, the onus is on those consumers who care about this to make sure that Walmart knows a commercial is not good enough. Ads don't create jobs. You need to engage us through our businesses. And it was through the experiment, looking for those products and seeing how wholly disenfranchised we are, that this whole issue came to bear. And I hope that as we keep talking about this, we'll really start pushing corporate America to start investing more in supplier, vendor, franchisee, and dealer diversity.
One other thing that you said in the book was that, tell me how Black businesses rank in terms of employing Black people. Where do they rank?
Well, we are the largest private employer of Black people. Black businesses have no problem hiring Black people. And the phenomenon is the same in other ethnic groups. Korean-owned businesses hire Koreans. Greek businesses hire Greek people. Indian-owned businesses hire Indian people. Black-owned businesses hire Black people. Black unemployment is the highest, 3, 4, 5 times the national average in some places like Birmingham and Detroit and Gary. So if these businesses were more successful, they could do what they always do and hire more Black people, and we can counter unemployment. And that's why that's one reason our unemployment is so high, because the businesses that employ Black people are not successful enough to employ. So in terms of all the ethnic groups, Black businesses are the highest sole proprietorships, and I'm sure that my brother here can tell you better numbers, but in terms of being able to, there are numbers that say how many businesses we have, and there are numbers that demonstrate how many businesses that actually hire people. Black businesses are by far the highest number of businesses that don't employ anyone. So, and that's because they're not successful enough to employ. But if they were successful enough to employ, we'd have, they would be able to employ more people and counter unemployment. The key to countering unemployment in the Black community is to support Black businesses so that those businesses would be, we would enable them to hire more people. As long as we don't support, if you care so much about unemployment, you need to be supporting Black businesses every day.
Okay, so your book, Tom, doesn't talk a lot about businesses, but I wanted to know, in your research, did you come up at all with, are the types of business an indicator of the desirability of a community? And then the other thing I wanted to talk, you talk about private family wealth in the Book of Life a lot. How much is that tied to ownership, business ownership? Did that come up at all in your research?
In the interviews we've done now over the course of 12 years, between 1998, 1999, and 2011 and 12, we actually are picking up a considerably larger number of both white but more African American families that are into entrepreneurship. But it's a different kind of form that I think is important to talk about, because we are in many communities still in the midst of an extraordinary Great Recession that has had not simply a deep impact, but has had the duration of it has been sustained now in those communities for many, many years. So as jobs, as traditional jobs have been undercut and have become much more unstable, even for middle-class families, we are beginning to see more people going into consulting. First, to add on to their job, to try and patch it up to 40 hours a week, to try and patch a middle-class income out of that. And then in too many cases, slowly the balance starts to shift so that those kinds of consulting arrangements become their major source of income. It's great, but it's also very tenuous. It's dependent on all the kinds of things that Maggie's talking about. There's very little control that the African American community or any local community has over the need for those kinds of services that those kind of consultants are doing. So in sociological terms, if you will, those consultantships often look like a substitute for a job that is no longer stable for them. And that kind of, and they don't employ very many people importantly, other than themselves and maybe a partner, maybe one other person. And that's a very, very small business. Now, maybe those will grow, and that would be incredibly great. And it'll be a source of strength, and it'll be a source of assets to the African American community or whatever community that they happen to be based in. The largest transfer of wealth doesn't come from business ownership per se. What it comes from is property in the form of home ownership. And that's especially true for middle-class families, both white, Black, Latino, and everybody else in American society. The rate of business formation is not all that great in any culture in the United States. Those that do it and do it very, very well obviously have a lot more to pass along to their children, and the advantages that they pass along to their children and other members of their family. They're very blessed to have the opportunity to do that, but that also creates disadvantages for families and young adults that are equally achieving but don't have that kind of push, that kind of support, that kind of launching pad from their own families.
You talked about income supplies life support, assets provide opportunities. I remember that was a quote from your book. You also talk about money flow, which you found was different from in general in African American families as opposed to white families. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'm not sure what you mean, but let me take a stab. And again, this has even become much more poignant for us as we've done the follow-up interviews with the set of nearly 200 families. When in 1998 and 1999, when we would ask a young white family, and I remember an instance actually in Boston very vividly. We would sit in their living room, and it was a young couple. They didn't have children yet. They lived out in Sharon. They were doing pretty well. They both had jobs. She was a nurse. He was a carpet salesman, or he was in retail. And I asked them the question, after they had detailed to us all of the really kind and generous support they had gotten from their parents that allowed them to buy a home in Sharon, which was very nice. And sort of towards the end of that interview, I asked them, have you ever helped your parents out? They laughed. And it was that kind of nervous laughter that was both very loud and at the same time told a story in itself. The idea of that question was so preposterous. You know, they were in a position to help their parents. Now, everything was flowing the other way for that family and a lot of other families in a very similar kind of situation. Now, in the African American families that we interviewed, especially the middle-class African American families, they tended to be the successful outliers in that family. That is, they were more successful economically than others. So the window of opportunity about who in your family do you go to if you can't meet the electric bill? Who in your family do you go to in Boston if you break an axle in the winter and you need $900 for an axle and a new set of tires? You go to the most successful person in your network and the person that you think is most generous. So that, in fact, there was one person who his wife referred to him as the Bank of Richard. Because Richard couldn't say no. And she was all over him about that. She had made him promise to stop lending money to all the relatives that never paid him back, and believe me, he had no expectation of ever being paid back. And he had made the pledge not to loan any more money, except she kind of looked at him and said, what happened when your cousin was over 2 weeks ago? Mm-hmm. And yeah, he had broken the pledge and he had lent money again, knowing that that was the 5th or 6th time and that money wasn't coming back. But he was helping his network. And he was in a position to do so. Now, we can argue, I don't know if we're going to argue, but maybe he should, maybe he shouldn't. I think there's a lot of positive value to that. But it means that he's using his wealth to support others in his network. Now, it's not a lot. It's not of the order of giving the cousin a down payment to buy the house that'll put the cousin in a safer community and put their children in a much higher quality school district. No, it was the kind of end-of-the-month money. It was the kind of making ends meet money, of trying to get to that end of the month and not be as much in debt as he had been the previous month.
Candelaria?
Yes?
Can we open the mic up for questions?
Yeah, can we ask maybe one more question?
Sure.
Do it? Okay, all right, thank you. You talked about the class clash between middle class blacks and lower class. And Tom, you talked about many middle class blacks living sort of in a buffer zone. So I thought I'd have you make a comment on that. And then in the film, we saw this wonderful supermarket that I'm presuming was a black-owned supermarket and having read the book, it was. I would like you to tell a little bit about that story as well.
Okay.
Okay.
And then we can go to questions. The clash thing, it just became, we all know it exists, especially within the black community. We consider ourselves a community. We're all proud to be black. But at the same time, the whole thing is to get out of the hood and get as far away from it as you possibly can, if you can. And that distancing ourselves from the masses is a way of life for folks who have been able to leverage educational opportunities and blessings and luck that my husband and I have been able to leverage. And we started to notice this phenomenon quite acutely as we engaged in the experiment. That we didn't know that in the west side of Chicago, predominantly the blackest part of Chicago, that the businesses were not black-owned, was a shock to us, and it was very heartbreaking. But the point was, we never spent any time in the west side of Chicago. We would drive over and around the west side of Chicago. We didn't know anyone in the west side of Chicago. Why would we ever dare go to the west side of Chicago, even though that was our community. Those are the black people that we always talk about lifting up when we go to all of our fancy conferences and we sip our martinis and talk about fixing Black America. We're talking about the west side, but we never spent any time on the west side. that year was my returning to the West Side and seeing and living how my West Side family lives. And it really made me understand how the kind of hypocritical life I was living and a lot of my peers live. And in terms of the experiment and what we're trying to bear out with the experiment, it made all of those problems crystal clear. A big reason that only 2 to 6% of our money stays in our community is because a lot of the folks with money, with more money, folks like John and I and our friends, we leave the community, and where our ability to leave the community, our ability to buy polo, our ability to have fancy vacations and buy nice cars and live in white suburbs, we wear that as a badge of honor. So in so doing and having that lifestyle and having that sense of attainment, we are steadily supporting fewer and fewer of our businesses. And this point of supporting our businesses, that's part of the bougie life. You don't. So if you have the wherewithal to get a white accountant or have a white firm finish your basement, why would you even consider going to a black accountant or a black remodeling company? Why would you even consider going to a black grocery store when you can go to Whole Foods? That just doesn't make any sense. So that gap became crystal clear during the experiment, and it explained part of that leakage. A big reason that folks who live on the West Side experience the horrible crisis that leakage results in is that a lot of the businesses in the West Side are not black owned. And they have to leave the West Side and come to where I live, Oak Park, just to get decent goods and services. There is no Walmart on the West Side of Chicago. There is no, there's not the local shop owners there don't have quality goods and services. So a lot of those folks get in their cars or get on the bus and come to where I live to buy their goods and services, the things that they need to survive. So the leakage comes from local businesses are not owned by local people, and they have to shop outside of the community. So that's a big chunk of the leakage. The other part of the leakage is folks who do have a choice, who can buy wherever they want and have the wherewithal to shop wherever they want. We choose not to support our own because we think we're too good to support our own. And that's the essence of the class. And that whole making it out thing contributes to our social demise. And the whole thing is the whole community applauds our ability to buy polo and Gucci, but is not thinking about the deleterious impact that has on us socially and economically. And the whole point was to do what we needed to do so that John and Maggie can go to Harvard and go to University of Chicago and get their JD and MBA and become executives at McDonald's. But the second part of it was so that John and Maggie can come back and help the West Side. And that's the part in the clash, the stratification between the classes that totally is on the onus is on the middle and upper classes. Everyone worked so hard for me to get here, but we haven't been fulfilling our duty to give back. We've been absolutely enjoying the blessings of all of that, but the other part was to give back. And the best way to give back is to support the businesses. But part of being who we are means that we do not support the businesses. So that's the absolute psychosis of the class. Real quick about the grocery store. You saw that beautiful store. You saw that it was perfect. It was just this wonderful place. A lot of people see that video and assume it's not black owned. Yes, it was a black owned store. The gentleman who owned it is a part of our family still. Is a wonderful one. He's the exact prototype of why we did this. He's someone who built a fantastic quality enterprise in the community, hired from the community, demonstrated our community's ingenuity and talent, and provided great goods and services for poor people who deserve them but can't get them otherwise. Everything perfect. And the money that could have come out of that business could have helped build that community up. He's exactly why we did the empowerment experiment. He was everything that the empowerment experiment represents. he failed, the empowerment experiment failed. He did. That store is gone. He actually, and it was, aside from losing my mother, was the absolute most heartbreaking thing that we experienced through this experiment, that that perfect place could not make it. That's not, you know, the KKK's fault. That's not racism's fault. That's not Demand's fault, Charlie's fault, whatever you want to call it. That's not anyone's fault but our own, that that store is gone. We should have lifted it up, and we didn't, and he's gone, and all the promise that could have come from it. Kareem should have 20 of those stores by now, and they're gone. So it makes me cry just thinking about it, but at the same time, we just hope that, you know, if we keep this message out, maybe we can bring Kareem back, because we absolutely need to have local-owned grocery stores in our community. We're entitled to that. 400 years. It's just a basic right for us to be able to have grocery stores in our community.
So let's take some Q&A, and I'm going to also ask you about some of your suggestions for ways to build assets. So any questions?
For Maggie Anderson, you didn't have any guilt feelings about increasing your carbon footprint by driving 20 miles out of your way over and over again, and perhaps driving out of your way for other products?
I try. I am very, very concerned about the environment. So that's not something that I take lightly. I wish that in trying to support my community and trying to take this stand and trying to get this message out to the world, the importance of the Black community being economically enfranchised in America, it would have been much easier. I wish I could have just walked down the street to the west side of Chicago and supported those businesses, but they didn't exist there. I did have to drive that far. And yes, I do feel guilty about those kind of things every day. It is a balancing act. It's no one's, I can't say that the experiment in and of itself is perfect, but for me, this is my most important issue. I see that kids are dying in my community because of food deserts. I see that kids are shooting each other because they don't have local role models anymore to look up to like they used to, because the only successful business owners in the Black community are gangbangers and drug dealers. So for me, the most important thing I can do, no matter how far I have to drive, is to make sure that we bring those businesses back that can cure those problems. But to answer your question, I absolutely, yes, did feel guilty as much as I do every day when I do something wasteful that counters our protecting our environment.
Thank you very much.
Can I just,
question?
one more?
No, let's have another question. You can come back later. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you for tonight's conversation.
I can't hear you. Can you speak up a little bit?
How about now? Is it better? I want to ask a question about assumptions that the Black community makes. One assumption, as you mentioned, is success for many Black people is to get a job, to get a good job in a corporation rather than pursuing entrepreneurship. Are there any other wrong assumptions that in the Black community that you want to address?
I'm sorry. So I didn't understand.
Can you repeat it? It was hard to hear.
Okay.
So you're questioning the assumption that Black families push their children into finding good jobs in corporate America?
My question is, are there any other wrong assumptions that you want to address?
Oh, are there any
other wrong assumptions?
Any wrong assumptions? So would that be a wrong assumption that our kids want to, well, a bad assumption or an assumption that leads to, well, the main bad assumption, and it is a wrong assumption. And again, a lot of these issues are cultural. So sometimes when I sound like I'm stating something as fact, it is factual because this is reality for my people. And, you know, like, you know, the fact that we have to shop in liquor stores for bananas. But it's this whole phenomenon that the white man's ice is colder. That is something that's totally in our heads, and many Black consumers across classes assume that if they were to buy goods or services from anyone who is not Black, that it's better. They assume that Black businesses, Black products, Black firms, Black entrepreneurs are inferior. And that assumption is almost factual. It bears itself out every day in our community. And it's, like I said, it's something that we joke about, but it does have almost a quantifiable, horrible, tangible impact on our community. And that is the worst assumption. So the biggest thing that we're trying to address with this experiment is all up here, getting our folks to have more pride in each other, be more accountable for our future. So it's not just about you have that, so we should have it too. It's about working from a different paradigm and a different assumption that our goods and services are just as good. It's a little harder to find, but let me go out and do my best to support local businesses that are investing in my community. And if we have that in our heads, a lot of things would change.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Another question?
Hi. I just want to start by saying I'm so proud of you. Thank you for your contribution. What you've done is. So thank you. So I just wanted to talk about the reasons that I have been hindered from supporting some of the black businesses, and I want you to address it. Like, what I've found is two things that offend me. One is that, like, the larger black-owned, or what I assume is black-owned businesses, like Miss Jessie's Hair Products, you might be familiar with. They're really big franchise, and what they do is they advertise. They're starting, now that they want to, I guess, increase their base, in their advertising, they use women who aren't black. Like, and I notice that happens a lot of the times, especially when black businesses want to get really big, they start becoming non-black, in a sense. If that, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
And then the second thing that puts me off is that you want to go support these businesses, but sometimes it is substandard. Like, you don't want to deal with the aggravation of people showing up late, and you can't get the same quality. You know what I mean? It happens. Let's not pretend. I didn't want to be an advocate, but it's true. So can you address how you kind of got around some of that and still continued with the same fortitude to want to support these businesses, and, you know, talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, because it totally is my life. I mean, you know, we're not in the experiment anymore, but it is my life. We do support black businesses every day. Most of my money goes to our businesses. So fortunately, most of the businesses I support now are businesses I've been supporting since the experiment. So I'm not out on the hunt anymore. I'm not having those new experiences as much. But I do understand what you're saying. And again, this is a cultural phenomenon. But because there were so many other painful experiences, because I got so angry seeing how behind we are in this community, it did force me to at least try to understand why we are where we are and why those businesses are the way they are. So it's tougher for me to say, you know what, I'm not going to give you a second chance, or I'm not going to support you, when I understand that it used to be that business was perfect. It used to be that business was a great business. But a lot of these folks are business owners in our community now. They've been, as Professor Shapiro brought out, forced into entrepreneurship. And they start businesses in our struggling communities, surrounded by these absolutely dismal environments. So they're only reflecting what they see every day. They're not proud of themselves. Their communities, our communities are dirty and in shambles. So they reflect that in their businesses. Those business owners, say someone like me, who lives in a different kind of community. If I were just to decide I wanted to own a business, if I say I wanted to start a tea shop, and that business, and I wasn't forced into entrepreneurship because I couldn't find a job, and I had some money, and I do the way other folks do from other groups, and go to my family and get a loan from my community bank that has a bunch of money because that community is self-sustaining, and I start my business, it would be a fantastic tea shop that you would love to go to. Those are the tea shops, those are the businesses that I'm supporting. These are fantastic, top quality businesses that are also hiring other black people that can't find jobs otherwise. They're showing the world that we are just as talented and offer just as good services as anyone else. So those businesses do exist, but the ones in, let's say, the west side of Chicago or in Newark or in Gary are a lot of those folks who are just trying to survive, and it's cheap to start a shea butter business, or it is cheap to sell incense or something like that. So they start something in the community, and they don't have the money, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the training, they don't have the network to really build that business up. And all of that has to do with the historical, cultural factors that led to the demise of the West Side to begin with. So they're suffering for the same reasons that the whole West Side is suffering. So I can't give up on that business owner just as much as I can't give up on the West Side. Kids on the West Side are tougher to deal with than kids who grow up in Oak Park. They have different environments. They have different folks to look after them. But I can't give up on that kid on the West Side because they had it different. So with those businesses, I can't say that I'm giving them license to give us inferior goods or services, but at least I come in there with that paradigm. And what's interesting is in the Hispanic community, because I come from a Hispanic family. My family's Cuban. In the Hispanic community, you can go into a dress shop that's substandard, a bakery, a dollar store, and it's not this perfect, pristine place, but they don't even go into the store with these blockers. The point is, this is my brother or sister. It's like breathing. Of course I'm gonna go into this place. It's not, oh, let me give them a shot versus something else. That's all they do. So there's no comparing. We are not that way. So we go into these places saying, it's not as good as that Oak Park business that Maggie would have started, so I'm gonna go in there and give them a hard time, and I'm not gonna come back unless it's perfect like that Oak Park business. We can't be that way, because we have to understand why that business is not as good as the Oak Park business. I know that's tough for you to swallow, but that's
Okay, we're going to thank
we
you.
have to
We'll get to
look at
another
that.
question, but I wanted to say there are two other phenomena that I've witnessed.
and I can talk to you about the other thing too.
Yeah.
About the
One is where I've seen
to
people
be or
go
not
in-
to be black is what we call it.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the businesses.
I've seen a lot of people go into black stores and compare prices, and they'll say things like, well, I could get it cheaper at TJ Maxx. So that's one thing that I see a lot of people do. And secondly, I had a friend come in town for a conference. She stayed at the Marriott Hotel by the Copley Plaza. As she was walking me to the train station with her daughter, she says, oh, we're gonna go to Saks and shop. And I said, well, there's this black Nouvelle fashion. I said, there's a black-owned shop right here. You should check it out. She said, they'll be too expensive. I said, you're going to Saks.
From the Copley Plaza.
I couldn't convince her to go into the boutique. And I was like, and I've really been talking to her about it. It really bothered me. Like, if you're going to go to Saks, how are you going to decide? I said, this black-owned business has been here 15, 20 years. Just go see what they have. I mean, you can window shop. But she just found it. For some reason, she couldn't make herself go into it. Next question.
And I was next door to Nouveau. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I say that because I think it's really important for people to have the attitude of being serial entrepreneurs. I've had two businesses. A lot of people know about both businesses. Treasure Legacy, which was next door to Nouveau Fashion at Copley Place, and Jamaica Way Books, which was in Jamaica Plain. It looked like the store probably that they said, they couldn't be owned by a black business. You know, both businesses were not successful. They eventually failed, but we maintained them for quite a while. But I want to tell you a story because you mentioned that, you know, we encourage people to, you know, go out and to be able to buy into, you know, the stores where they can afford it. And I just want to tell you a story about Treasure Legacy when I first opened. It was in Copley Place, where there was the Saks, there was the, you know, Neiman Marcus and the Gucci and all of that, you know, and it was a store that specialized in African American art and culture. And when I first opened up that business, there was an elderly African American lady who passed by the store on the outside. She didn't want to come in, so I had to invite her in. She came in, she walked around, she looked at all the framed posters, and she went to buy a note card with a print by Elizabeth Catlett, an African American artist, on it. And she came up to the counter and she opened up her handkerchief. You know, she was at Copley, well, she was outside, but she was at Copley. Her money was in a handkerchief. And she had to count out her coins from that handkerchief onto the counter. And so when she finished, I said, you have a nice day. You know, staff person, that's your job. You're supposed to tell your customer, have a nice day. And I will never forget, this was 1992, what she told me, I have had a nice day now that I see you're here. And that really has made me, even want to keep going, even though it's always hard. It's always hard. And you know what? White businesses fail too.
Right.
That's something we have to accept. It's not just about, oh, we're black business, we're going to fail. Business is hard. I don't care who you are. There are some advantages if you're a white business that you may not have as a black business. But I really applaud you to sort of bring a highlight to the fact that, we, African Americans do need to sort of lift up. And I have to sort of give my head off to Candelaria at this point, because every year at Christmas time, she would bring a tour group is probably outside of the neighborhood. It was called the Roxbury Christmas Tour. And we weren't in Roxbury, but she would let that group stop by our store to shop. And I really appreciate that, and it's like those type of gestures really did lift us up and kept us going, It was a bookstore, so, the writing was on the wall, but the point being that, there are African Americans out there who are trying to lift you up, and, everyone, I said, oh, they're rich enough to sort of go buy in another neighborhood. African Americans want to see other African Americans succeed.
Yep. Yes. Yes.
So keep applauding. I will be back.
Thank you for your comment. Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Shapiro. I wanted to ask you, so a lot of the issues that you brought up about inheritance and the jobs within the black community have to do with institutionalized racism that has been perpetuated by the white community for hundreds of years. How do you think the best way to educate the white community on these systemic issues, and do you think that could ever be possible in a grand scheme of things due to what like Tim Wise would call white denial?
And could you also maybe segue that into some of the proposals you make at the end of the book? That would be great.
Well, how does the saying go? Denial is not simply a river in Egypt.
Denial.
It's something that's pretty basic to people who have great advantages or even moderate advantages, where the cultural context in the society tells us that we need to earn everything that we own or possess. So there's a great sort of cultural and ideological Jedi mind trick that happens, where you will talk to people, young adults, about how, for example, how they, tell me the story of how you bought your first home. And they will be very forthright and very honest and talk about, well, we were struggling, we were holding garage sales, and my mother over dinner thought this was ridiculous, and this is a true story of somebody we interviewed. So she wrote a $30,000 check, and that was our down payment. Later in the course of that interview, maybe about an hour later, when we're going through another checklist with the same person who just told us that, and we ask her another way of asking how you saved the money, she talked about she had earned it all. She said, we deserved it. We earned it. We had garage sales. And in their mind, the fact of having garage sales, and I would dare suggest millions of Americans have garage sales, but millions of Americans aren't fortunate enough to have mothers and mother-in-laws to write $30,000 checks. So that kind of flipped in her mind. So there is a long-term project around facing our own history, around facing our own stories and being able to tell our own stories that are linked to policy, that are linked to the institutional mechanisms that made opportunity much easier for some people and much more difficult for others. And that's a long, it's not going to, obviously it's not happening overnight. It's a long resolution we have to have with our own society. And I do think at a certain level, it does start at the very personal level, and it does involve, the case by case, it involves culture, but it profoundly also needs to go to the story of how our institutions were built and the ways in which they have institutionalized patterns of advantage and disadvantage, patterns of what we would call being racialized. And it's that kind of dynamic that we need to talk about. So if we try and segue away from the the horror stories about how we got in this situation, to think about what can we do. We had a short meeting before we walked in here, and I made the rash, if not bold, statement that we know how to do things. We know how to get out of all of this. I could sit up here, and I'm sure Maggie could, and we could tell you best practices, we could tell you stories, we could tell you pilot projects, we could tell you demonstrations, we could tell you programs that work and work well. But they're not at scale, they're small, they're not funded, and they lack, what do they lack? They lack political will.
So
They lack the political will that will take them to scale. So one example.
And let me just, before
Sure.
you go too long-winded, I've been informed we have 10 more minutes left
okay.
in this room, and we want to make sure that the
There's a
questions.
line.
Wow.
Yeah, so why don't we have the questions?
Thank
and
you.
then
Got you.
We can take it into the hall as you sign and continue.
Thank you
some
so
of
much for that question.
Sorry, but thank you. Yeah, next.
I'll try to keep this quick, Candelaria.
Okay.
I'm Kelly Chun. I'm one of the consultant, sole proprietor entrepreneurs that you mentioned, but I'm celebrating 20 years in business. So it's been, thank you. It's been quite a roller coaster. It's no joke, as they say. But I had a question about federal, state, city, and federal procurement as a path to wealth and job creation in communities of color. And before I leave the mic, I'll just make a quick announcement. One of the projects I'm working on is a business disparity study for the Mass Department of Transportation, where we're looking at what a lot of entrepreneurs are living, disparities in businesses that are owned by women and people of color across the state. But we'll be examining businesses of all kinds, white, Black, Latino, Asian businesses that are owned by women. And out of that, hopefully, will come some strategies and recommendations to increase access to procurement opportunities in the Commonwealth. It speaks to the political will that you were talking about. But the comment was, the question was about federal procurement and that being a pathway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. That space is just as important to me as the corporate space. And what happens a lot, and everyone knows this, is that we don't, because of how we are treated and we're not seen as a business force, we don't have a seat at those tables. So what happens is a big government project or big construction project will come up, and we'll hear about it way too late, and then we're fighting for scraps, leftover deals at the end. And because this is the way it works, that in the initial stages, certain people are at that table, and they're usually not people of color. They get all the big deals. They know that they have to fulfill these set-asides that are usually not enforced. At the end of the game, once it's all public and you see people drilling on the streets, you start involving, local community leaders, those same kind of folks, and they come to the table, and we get small scraps, but right, they pick one, and those same folks keep getting the deals, right? And then so what happens is, and those are photo ops, so we keep reinforcing that same cycle. So when the big ribbon cutting happens, you have this big diverse picture of all these folks who are involved, but money-wise, percentage-wise, we may get 0.00% of the deal. And so that's part of the fight. The reason those folks, the reason some, Italian-owned construction companies, the reason some the Asian-owned construction companies or different kinds of firms get involved in those deals is because those communities have a strong economic base. And you cannot have a deal, you can't have anything going on without involving those communities, but you can easily do something like that without involving those same Black community leaders that that come at the end of the day for the photo ops. So we really need to make sure that those strong businesses that we do have, like in the corporate space, those strong suppliers to some of our corporations, those successful businesses that we do have, need to start paying more attention in the corporate space, because they do have influence, they do have contacts too. We need to have them focusing more on that government money. That's the answer for that.
And you can continue to talk. Yes, sir.
My question is for either of you, Ms. Anderson or the professor here. But we talk a lot about how black people have failed other black people, and it's true. I choose to buy my Jordans, at a black-owned business where I could buy it somewhere else. But my question is, what role do white people or white America play in the success or failure of black business?
Thank you.
Oh,
would you
that's
like to have Tom?
Let me take the
Okay,
let me
you go
take
first.
the first shot.
How's it going?
And then one more.
I, by choice, my wife and I, and our son grew up in a community that we chose because we think it is one of the more inclusive, diverse communities in Boston, which is tough to come by. It's Jamaica Plain. We've lived there for a long period of time now, and there is, I think, a value at all kinds of levels to the kind of inclusiveness that is a part of the value of communities like that. But it's not easy work. It's not simply making the courageous or not courageous choice of renting somewhere, buying a home somewhere. No, it is. It's something that has to be thought about all the time, has to become active in the community, or act on how others in the community are acting on your behest, to try and maintain the kind of levels of diversity and inclusion that you think are important and that I think are important. And so, if I can connect that to add on to a part of what Maggie was just saying, in some communities that, because of zoning and regulations and other mechanisms that we actually created, they're levers. So there's something called a community bargaining agreement. So that any time a new business wants to come into a community, you can force them to have the conversation. You want to come in because you want the Latinos in this community, the African Americans, the white yuppies to shop here. Now, we want your institution to look like the people it's going to serve. And we want your institution to serve the cultural competency and the cultural needs of that community as well. And we don't just want to see them as the people picking up the bags to carry to your car. We want to see them behind the cash registers. We want to see them as managers. We want to see them all the way to the top. Okay. And I think that's a way that all communities can help in that kind of vision of a future.
Okay,
tonight, I just want to make an announcement. Tonight, unfortunately, we have to leave the theater right at 8. We can go in the lobby and stay in the lobby all night, and the two speakers will be there signing their books, but I want to make sure we answer all the questions before we take off.
So you're going to allow me.
We got this. We got one more question.
Okay, so okay.
And she wanted to.
I wanted to answer his question in terms of what the white community can or should do to support black businesses. This message, I mean, we got to be clear. We have a very diverse audience. We did this to get more black folks to support our own. It was completely targeted at our own. If I'm yelling at anyone, it's black people. However, what I've earned in this journey is this right to inspire and educate. And what's been the most beautiful part about this is how many folks from outside of the community we've educated in this journey. Paul Solomon from PBS NewsHour just told me that our segment about this family who's supporting local black businesses is the highest rated segment on PBS NewsHour, which isn't, I'm not sure, but probably isn't the #1 show for the black community. So those are white consumers, white people out there watching that show and being inspired by it. When we took CBS News across the west side of Chicago and had them go door to door and interviewed those folks and see who was black owned, and they saw throughout the whole west side of Chicago, that whole main strip, none of those businesses were black owned. They chose to do a whole segment just based on that phenomenon. There's
Maggie,
a lot of folks
I'm so
outside
sorry. I
the
never
community
do
don't
this, but we
understand.
need to. We
okay,
really need to finish up.
Okay, so the
one
point
more.
is, if this is for everybody. It's just about conscious consumerism. If you care about what's going on in the black community, anyone should do their part to support this sister. What my community needs, what will fix our community and make the country better, is to have more, for this sister to have 20 stores.
Okay, and one more question.
All of you can support her.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Now, in my profession, I attend a lot of seminars where CPAs attend. I've probably seen maybe over 1,000 people at these seminars. I don't think there were more than 3 or 4 black people at any of these seminars total. You just can't find them. I don't know how many people who are black are CPAs in this area. I don't know what it is elsewhere. But I do know if you're going to run a business, you have to know something about accounting, you got to know something about marketing, you got to know something about finance. And if you don't have some basic understanding of that, no matter what you do in business, you're not going to make it, because you're either going to price your stuff too low, too high, or not market it properly. And what I want to know is, what are you doing, what can you do basically to get more African American black people to learn about business, so that when they do go into business, they understand how business works, so that they can be successful at it, rather than just have no clue what they're doing and fail.
Black enterprise, and we can take that
and that's absolutely phase 2. This problem about the demand piece, just about consumers not supporting the quality businesses like the sisters that we already have, that's a huge problem in our community. But the second piece is absolutely that our businesses our business owners don't have the same level of expertise and training that our counterparts do. So that's a huge issue for this experiment, to make sure that our business owners have that kind of training. A reason that someone like me, who does have those skills, would not get into business, because an Asian person like me with my same kind of credentials would go into businesses, because they know automatically when they come out of business school that they have a whole infrastructure of support waiting for them to be successful. There's no reason that someone like me would dare open a business in a black community, because I know it's going to fail. I mean, that's the mindset that I have in my community. So a lot of the brain trust that we do have are not going into entrepreneurship. So one thing we have to do is help those folks who do want to be entrepreneurs, who don't have the training and education, and the ones that do, folks like me, we need to be pushing folks like me into entrepreneurship. We need to be the next round of entrepreneurs, because someone like me can be at that seminar and go head to head with any of you guys.
Thank you so much. Big hand for our speakers.
Yeah.